Michael adjusted his tie, the cheap polyester scratching against his freshly shaven neck. Tonight was a big night. Not in the grand scheme of things, maybe, but for him, it felt monumental. 3 weeks on the job, and he was finally getting a solo run. Well, almost solo. He'd be piloting the last train on the Red Line, the notorious Night Owl, as the veteran drivers called it. He scoffed inwardly. Night Owl. Honestly, some of these guys talked like they were warding off ancient spirits instead of driving a glorified metal tube through a tunnel. Superstitions ran rampant in the break room. Tales of phantom passengers, unexplained delays, and the infamous tunnel walkers, shadowy figures glimpsed only in the periphery, said to bring bad luck or worse. Michael chalked it up to boredom and too much late-night coffee. He was a pragmatist, a recent engineering graduate, and he believed in logic, schedules, and the well-maintained machinery of the MTA. He glanced at his reflection in the darkened window of the train car. Clean-cut, eager, maybe a little too green. He wanted to prove himself, show the older guys he wasn't just some kid fresh out of college. He wanted to earn their respect, not by swapping ghost stories, but by being the most reliable, efficient driver on the roster. Tonight was his chance. The platform was nearly deserted, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long, lonely shadows. A few stragglers huddled on benches, lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the hum of the approaching train. Michael performed his pre-departure checks with meticulous care, double-checking every gauge and switch. He wanted everything to be perfect. He climbed into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of ozone and worn metal filling his nostrils. He ran through the startup sequence, the train responding with a reassuring rumble. He glanced at his watch. 11:57 p.m. Almost time. He took a deep breath. A surge of nervous energy coursing through him. This was it. Time to show them what he could do. Time to conquer the Night Owl, and prove that some things are just best explained by facts. The clock ticked over to midnight. Michael pulled the lever, the train gliding smoothly out of the station. The Red Line at this hour was practically a ghost train, servicing only a handful of stops on the outer edges of the city. These stations were smaller, older, with platforms that seemed to stretch into the darkness, swallowed by the tunnels. He tried to focus on the task at hand, announcing each stop with practiced precision. Next stop, Oak Haven Station. But with each passing station, the number of passengers dwindled, until he was essentially alone in the long, echoing train car. The silence became oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic screech of the wheels on the tracks and the low hum of the train's engine. A prickle of unease began to creep up his spine. He tried to rationalize it. It was late, he was tired. And the stories he'd dismissed earlier were now replaying in his mind like a broken record. He glanced at the security monitor, scanning the empty cars. Nothing. Just shadows and the faint glow of the emergency lights. He told himself it was the isolation. Back in college, he could handle late nights and early mornings no problem, but he was always surrounded by other people. Study groups, late-night pizza runs, the comforting murmur of conversation. Here, it was just him, the train, and the seemingly endless darkness. The tunnels themselves seemed different tonight, darker somehow. The concrete walls felt closer, pressing in on him. He imagined things in the periphery, fleeting glimpses of movement, shadows that danced just beyond the edge of his vision. He blinked, refocusing on the tracks ahead. Just his imagination, he told himself. Just fatigue playing tricks on his eyes. But the feeling persisted, a knot tightening in his stomach. He gripped the controls tighter, his knuckles white. He told himself it was just the loneliness, just the late hour. Just the fact that he was alone on a deserted subway line, hurtling through the darkness beneath the city. He tried to whistle, but the sound died in his throat. The silence was too complete, too profound. He was starting to feel genuinely isolated. Just as Michael was about to leave the initial station, a figure materialized at the driver's side window. It was Old Man Hemlock, a driver nearing retirement, his face a road map of wrinkles etched by years of navigating the city's underbelly. Hemlock had always been one of the most vocal proponents of the subway's darker legends, and Michael usually avoided him. Hemlock's eyes, however, were unusually serious, devoid of their usual twinkle of mischief. He tapped on the glass, beckoning Michael to roll down the window. "Evening, kid." Hemlock rasped, his voice like gravel rolling downhill. Heard you got the owl tonight. Michael forced a polite smile. Just doing my job, Mr. Hemlock. Hemlock ignored the attempt at formality. Take this. He thrust a sealed manila envelope through the opening. It was thick, heavier than it looked. Michael frowned. What's this? Just in case. Hemlock said, his gaze fixed on something beyond Michael, something unseen in the darkness of the tunnel. Don't open it unless you absolutely have to, understand? Absolutely necessary. Necessary for what? Michael asked, his skepticism returning. Is this some kind of prank? Hemlock's grip tightened on Michael's arm. His touch was surprisingly strong for an old man. This ain't no joke, son. There are things down here you don't understand. Things you don't want to understand. Just follow the instructions if you need to. And for God's sake, be careful. Before Michael could ask any more questions, Hemlock released his grip and stepped back from the train, disappearing into the shadows of the platform. Michael stared at the envelope in his hand, a growing sense of dread washing over him. He ran his fingers over the rough paper. There was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He glanced back at the platform. But Hemlock was gone. The only sound was the hum of the train and the distant echo of his own heartbeat. He placed the envelope on the dashboard, a nagging feeling telling him that whatever was inside, he wasn't going to like it. But Hemlock's urgency had been genuine, and a sliver of doubt had wormed its way into Michael's pragmatic mind. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to the night owl than just a late-night shift. The first few stops passed without incident. Oakhaven, then Elm Street, then the deserted platform of Cranbrook. At each stop, the doors opened and closed with a pneumatic hiss, the train trundling onward through the inky blackness. Michael tried to focus on the mechanics of his job, the rhythm of the rails, the steady hum of the engine. He told himself Hemlock was just trying to rattle him, to perpetuate the myths and legends that kept the old-timers entertained. But then, things started to shift. Subtle at first. Almost imperceptible. He noticed a flicker in the lights of his cabin, a brief stutter in the fluorescent tubes overhead. He checked the power gauge. Everything seemed normal. Then, a shadow moved in the corner of his eye, a fleeting darkness that danced independently of any visible object. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a product of his tired eyes. However, the disturbances grew more pronounced. The flickering lights became more frequent, more erratic. Confined solely to his train car while the platform lights remained steady and unwavering. He started hearing things too, faint whispers, barely audible above the rumble of the train. He strained his ears, trying to decipher the source, but it was always just at the edge of hearing, a murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He checked the security monitors again, more frequently now. Still nothing. The train cars were empty, save for the dancing shadows and the unsettling silence. He adjusted the volume on the radio, hoping to drown out the whispers, but the signal was weak, fading in and out with static. At the next stop, the platform was shrouded in an unnatural darkness, even darker than before. As the doors opened, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing at the far end of the platform, shrouded in shadow. He squinted, trying to make out the details. But the figure remained indistinct, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the tunnel. As soon as the doors began to close, the figure vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Michael gripped the controls, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. The logical explanations he had clung to were starting to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The envelope on the dashboard seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy, beckoning him to break the seal. He glanced at his watch. It was getting later, and the darkness was getting deeper. The whispers were getting louder. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the night was far from over. Michael's hand trembled as he reached for the envelope. The whispers were almost deafening now. A chorus of voices just beyond the threshold of understanding. He felt a cold sweat slicking his palms. He knew he shouldn't open it, that doing so would be an admission of defeat, a surrender to the irrational. But he couldn't ignore the growing sense of panic, the feeling that he was teetering on the edge of something terrifying. With a deep breath, he tore open the seal. The paper ripped with a sharp Decisive sound that echoed in the otherwise silent cabin. He pulled out the contents, a single, folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible, as if written in a desperate hurry. He recognized Hemlock's distinctive scrawl, but it was distorted, barely controlled. The paper contained a list of rules. Michael read the first rule aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Never acknowledge anyone on the platform after 1:17 a.m. He frowned. 1:17 a.m.? What was so special about that time? He scanned the rest of the list, his eyes widening in disbelief. If you hear knocking, do not stop the train, no matter what. The tunnels are not empty. Maintain speed. The emergency brake is a last resort. Its use invites them in. The rules were bizarre, nonsensical, completely divorced from any kind of rational explanation. They read like the ravings of a madman, a collection of paranoid superstitions. And yet, the urgency in Hemlock's handwriting, the genuine fear he had seen in the old man's eyes, gave the list a weight he couldn't ignore. Michael stared at the list, his mind reeling. Was this some elaborate prank? Had Hemlock finally snapped, succumbing to the pressures of years spent in the darkness? Or was there something more to it? Something truly sinister lurking beneath the surface? He glanced at his watch. 1:12 a.m. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent. He could feel a presence, something watching him from the shadows. He looked out at the approaching platform, the darkness seeming to writhe and twist. He gripped the controls, his knuckles white. 1:17 a.m. He only had 5 minutes. 5 minutes to decide whether to trust the word of a crazy old man, or to face whatever horrors awaited him in the darkness. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to dismiss the list, to ignore the superstitions and rely on his training. But the growing fear in his gut told him something else entirely. The digital clock on the dashboard flickered, 1:16 a.m. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the controls, his eyes darting between the tracks and the approaching platform. The whispers had intensified, swirling around him like a vortex of unseen voices. He could feel them pressing against his skin, urging him to look, to acknowledge. The train slowed as it approached the station, Willow Creek. He braced himself, steeling his resolve. He had to follow the rules, no matter how absurd they seemed. He had to trust Hemlock, even if it meant defying every logical instinct he possessed. As the train pulled into the station, he saw it. A figure on the platform. A woman, standing alone in the harsh fluorescent light, waving frantically. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with what looked like desperation. She was mouthing something, but he couldn't make out the words over the din of the train. 1:17 a.m. The clock changed, the numbers glowing with an ominous intensity. The woman on the platform continued to wave, her movements becoming more frantic, more urgent. She was pointing towards the train, gesturing as if trying to warn him of something. Michael's hand instinctively moved towards the door release. He wanted to stop, to help her, to find out what was wrong. But then he remembered the rule. Never acknowledge anyone on the platform after 1:17 a.m. The words echoed in his mind, a stark warning against the impulse to intervene. He hesitated, torn between his sense of duty and the chilling instructions on the list. The woman's face contorted in what looked like terror. She was screaming now, her voice a silent shriek against the rumble of the train. Michael could feel the weight of her gaze, the desperate plea in her eyes. It was almost unbearable. He fought the urge to stop, to open the doors, to offer assistance. He focused on the tracks ahead, forcing himself to ignore the woman's desperate cries. He repeated the rule in his head like a mantra, a shield against the growing sense of guilt and horror. The train began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed. As he pulled away from the station, he glanced back at the platform. The woman was still there, waving frantically, her face a mask of despair. As the train disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. Behind the woman, in the shadows, he saw movement, dark, indistinct shapes that seemed to writhe and twist, as if drawn to her like moths to a flame. He didn't know what they were, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were waiting for him to acknowledge her, waiting for him to break the rule, and he knew, with equal certainty, that he had made the right choice. But that didn't make it any easier to live with. The image of the woman on the platform, her silent scream, was burned into Michael's mind. He gripped the controls tighter, trying to shake off the feeling of guilt and horror. He knew he had done the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. The whispers continued, a constant, insidious drone that seemed to burrow into his skull. Then, he heard it. A faint tapping sound. At first, he thought it was just the normal creaks and groans of the train, the settling of metal under pressure. But then it became more distinct, more rhythmic. A steady, persistent knocking. Asterisk tap, 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 asterisk. It seemed to be coming from inside the train car walls, a hollow, echoing sound that resonated deep within his bones. Michael checked the security monitors again, his heart pounding in his chest. The cars were still empty, save for the dancing shadows. There was nothing to explain the knocking. Asterisk tap, 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 asterisk. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was as if something was trying to get out, scratching and clawing its way through the metal. Michael glanced at the list. Rule number 2. If you hear knocking, do not stop the train, no matter what. The knocking intensified, becoming a furious, desperate pounding. It was impossible to ignore, a relentless assault on his senses. He could feel the vibrations through the floor, through the seat, through his very being. Asterisk tap. Tap. Tap, asterisk. His first instinct was to stop the train, to investigate the source of the noise. He imagined a trapped passenger, banging on the walls for help. But then he remembered the rule, Hemlock's warning, the shadowy figures on the platform. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that stopping the train would be a death sentence. He gripped the controls, his knuckles white. He forced himself to focus on the tracks ahead, to ignore the pounding, to maintain his speed. The knocking continued, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. It was a test of his resolve, a challenge to his sanity. He tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation for the noise. Maybe it was a mechanical malfunction, a loose panel vibrating against the frame. But deep down, he knew that wasn't it. He knew that something else was at play, something dark and malevolent. The knocking continued, a relentless, rhythmic pulse that threatened to drive him mad. He had to stay strong, he had to follow the rules. He couldn't stop the train, no matter what. He didn't know what the fate of was, but he knew he had to keep moving. The knocking continued, a relentless percussion that echoed through the tunnels. Michael focused on maintaining his speed, his eyes fixed on the tracks ahead. He tried to ignore the sound, to block it out, but it was no use. It was as if the knocking was a part of him now, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked beneath the city. He glanced at the list again. Rule number 3. The tunnels are not empty. Maintain speed. The words sent a shiver down his spine. What did that mean? What else was down here with him, hidden in the darkness? He started to feel pursued, a sense of something gaining on him. He kept seeing movement in his periphery, fleeting glimpses of shadows that danced just beyond the edge of his vision. He strained his eyes, trying to make out what they were, but they were always just out of reach, disappearing into the darkness before he could get a clear look. He increased his speed, pushing the train to its limit. The wheels screeched against the tracks, the engine roared, but the feeling of being pursued only intensified. It was as if whatever was out there was keeping pace with him, matching his speed, closing the distance. He imagined dark, shapeless figures lurking in the shadows, their eyes glowing in the darkness. He imagined them clinging to the walls of the tunnel, their long, spindly limbs reaching out towards the train. He imagined them running alongside the tracks, their feet pounding against the concrete, their breath hot on his neck. He checked the security monitors again, his hands shaking. Still nothing. The cars were empty, save for the dancing shadows and the persistent knocking. But he knew they were there, lurking just beyond the reach of the cameras, waiting for him to slow down, waiting for him to make a mistake. The tunnels themselves seemed to be closing in on him, the walls pressing in tighter, the darkness becoming more oppressive. He felt as if he was trapped in a claustrophobic nightmare, hurtling through the darkness with unseen horrors nipping at his heels. He gripped the controls, his knuckles white. He had to maintain speed, he had to keep moving. He couldn't let them catch him. He didn't know what they were, or what they wanted, but he knew he didn't want to find out. The darkness was alive, and it was hungry. The train lurched to a halt at the next station, the screech of the brakes momentarily drowning out the relentless knocking. Michael braced himself, expecting another deserted platform, another wave of oppressive darkness. But when the doors opened, a figure stepped inside. A man. He was dressed in a simple, unremarkable suit, his face clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed. He looked like any ordinary commuter, perhaps a businessman working late. But something was off. His smile was too wide, too fixed. His eyes were too bright, too intense. He moved with a strange, unnatural smoothness, as if gliding rather than walking. The man approached the driver's cabin, his smile unwavering. "Evening, driver," he said, his voice smooth and melodious. "Long night, isn't it?" Michael stared at him, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't seen a passenger since the beginning of his shift. And this man, he just didn't feel right. "Yes, sir," Michael replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Just doing my job." The man chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "A very important job, I'm sure, keeping the city moving, even in the dead of night." He leaned closer, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Tell me, driver, do you believe in rules?" Michael hesitated. "Rules are there for a reason, sir." "Oh, I agree," the man said, his smile widening. "But sometimes rules are meant to be broken. Don't you think? Especially when they don't make any sense." He gestured towards the list on the dashboard. "I couldn't help but notice your instructions. Rather peculiar, wouldn't you say?" Michael's grip tightened on the controls. How did he know about the list? He hadn't shown it to anyone. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." The man laughed, a long, drawn-out sound that echoed in the cabin. "Oh, come now, driver. Don't be shy. We're all alone down here, in the darkness. We can be honest with each other." He leaned even closer, his breath hot on Michael's neck. "Tell me, what do you think of rule #1, the one about not acknowledging anyone on the platform after 1:17 a.m.? Seems rather cruel, doesn't it? What if someone needed help? What if someone was in danger?" Michael swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew this man was dangerous. He knew he was trying to trick him, to manipulate him into breaking the rules. "I just follow the instructions, sir." "But why?" the man persisted, his voice soft and persuasive. "Why follow rules that don't make any sense? Don't you have a mind of your own? Don't you care about helping people?" He reached out and touched Michael's arm, his touch cold and clammy. "Don't you want to be a hero?" The passenger's words hung in the air, a seductive whisper in the oppressive darkness. Michael fought to maintain his composure, to resist the man's insidious charm. He needed to remember what was at stake. His mind flashed back to a story he'd overheard in the break room, a hushed conversation between two veteran drivers. They were talking about Old Man Mallory, a driver who had disappeared years ago, vanished without a trace. Mallory had been a rule breaker, a skeptic who scoffed at the subways. Legends. The story went that one night, Mallory was running the night owl when he saw a group of teenagers stranded on the platform of a remote station. It was late, past 2 a.m., and a storm was brewing. Mallory, feeling a surge of compassion, decided to break protocol. He opened the doors and let them on. That was the last anyone ever saw of him. The train was found abandoned in the tunnel, the doors wide open, the lights flickering. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of what had happened. Mallory was simply gone. The official explanation was that he had suffered a mental breakdown, wandered off into the tunnels, and gotten lost. But the drivers knew better. They knew that Mallory had broken the rules, and that the subway had claimed him as its own. Some said they could still hear his screams echoing through the tunnels on quiet nights. Others claimed to have seen his ghost, a shadowy figure wandering the platforms, forever searching for a way out. The story had always seemed like a tall tale, another example of the driver's penchant for superstition. But now, as Michael stared into the unsettling eyes of the passenger, the story took on a new and terrifying significance. He understood that the rules were not just arbitrary restrictions, but a lifeline, a shield against the darkness that lurked beneath the city. Breaking them had consequences. Deadly consequences. He refocused on the passenger, who was still watching him with that unnerving smile. The man's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, as if he could see the fear that was churning inside him. Michael knew he couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. He had to stay strong, he had to follow the rules, or he would end up like Mallory, another ghost haunting the tunnels for eternity. Don't you want to be a hero? The passenger repeated, his voice dripping with honeyed persuasion. Michael stared at him, his mind racing. He knew this man was not what he seemed. He was a test, a temptation, a manifestation of the darkness that haunted the subway line. Who are you? Michael demanded, his voice trembling but firm. The passenger's smile widened, stretching his lips into a grotesque parody of human expression. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his features began to distort, shifting and blurring as if he were made of clay. The air around him shimmered and crackled with an unseen energy. I am what you fear, the passenger hissed, his voice a chorus of whispers and screams. I am the darkness between the stations, the echo in the tunnels, the hunger that never sleeps. I am the reason for the rules. Michael recoiled in horror, his blood running cold. He knew he was facing something ancient and malevolent, something that defied all logic and reason. This wasn't just a man. It was a force, a presence, a living nightmare. The passenger lunged towards him, his hand outstretched, his touch promising oblivion. Michael instinctively threw up his arm, shielding himself from the attack. The passenger's hand brushed against his skin, sending a jolt of icy terror through his body. Break the rules, driver, the passenger hissed, his voice a siren song of temptation. Give in to the darkness. Let me show you what true freedom feels like. Michael fought back, not with physical force, but with the strength of his will. He focused on the image of Hemlock, on the list of rules, on the memory of Mallory's fate. He repeated the rules in his head like a mantra, a shield against the passenger's insidious influence. I will not break the rules, Michael said, his voice ringing with defiance. I will not give in to you. The passenger snarled, his features contorting in rage. His eyes burned with a malevolent fury, and his voice became a guttural roar. You cannot resist me forever, driver, he bellowed. The darkness will consume you. Sooner or later you will break. The struggle was psychological, a battle of wills between Michael and the entity that sought to control him. It was a fight for his sanity, for his soul, for his very survival. He had to stay strong, he had to resist the temptation, or he would become just another victim of the Night Owl. The passenger, now fully transformed into a grotesque mockery of humanity, snarled and lunged again. Michael braced himself, knowing that physical resistance was futile. This was a battle of wills, a test of his resolve. He had to stay strong, he had to remember the rules. You cannot resist me, the entity roared, its voice echoing through the cabin. Your fear is my strength, your doubt is my weapon. It reached for the emergency brake lever, its clawed hand dripping with an oily, black substance. Stop the train, driver, it commanded. Let me show you what awaits in the darkness. Michael knew what was at stake. He remembered rule number 4. The emergency brake is a last resort. Its use invites them in. He didn't know who they were, but he knew they were far worse than anything he had encountered so far. He fought to maintain control of the train, his hands trembling on the controls. The entity was strong, its power fueled by the fear and darkness that permeated the subway line. He could feel its influence pressing against his mind, trying to break his will, to force him to yield. The entity grabbed his hand, its touch like ice. Stop the train, driver, it repeated, its voice a hypnotic drone. It's the only way to escape the madness. Michael gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He had to find a way to resist, to break free from the entity's control. He focused on the image of the woman on the platform, on the shadowy figures lurking behind her. He remembered the story of Mallory, his fate a chilling reminder of the consequences of breaking the rules. He wrenched his hand free from the entity's grasp, his heart pounding in his chest. I will not stop the train, he said, his voice ringing with defiance. I will not let you win. The entity shrieked in rage, its features contorting in a mask of pure hatred. It lunged again, its claws outstretched, its eyes burning with a malevolent fury. "Then you will share my fate, driver," it roared. "You will become one of us, forever trapped in the darkness." The struggle intensified, a desperate battle for control of the train, for control of Michael's mind, for control of his very soul. The emergency brake lever loomed before him, a tempting escape, a gateway to unimaginable horrors that he had to resist. He had to stay strong, or he would be lost forever. The entity pressed closer, its weight bearing down on Michael, its foul breath hot on his face that he could feel its power, its hunger, its desperation to break him. But he held firm, his grip tightening on the controls, his mind focused on the rules that he remembered Hemlock's warning, the old man's urgent plea. "Be careful, son. There are things down here you don't understand." He finally understood what Hemlock meant. He understood the darkness, the hunger, the malevolence that permeated the subway line, and he understood that the rules were the only thing standing between him and oblivion. He closed his eyes, blocking out the entity's grotesque visage. He focused on the feeling of the train beneath him, the rumble of the engine, the rhythm of the rails. He repeated the rules in his head like a mantra, a shield against the entity's insidious influence. "I will not break," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the roar of the train. "I will not give in." He reached out and grabbed the entity's wrist, his fingers digging into its cold, clammy flesh. He didn't have the strength to overpower it physically, but he had the will to resist, the determination to survive. He focused all his energy, all his resolve, into a single, unwavering thought. "I will not let you stop this train." The entity recoiled, its eyes widening in surprise. It could feel Michael's resistance, the strength of his will. It had underestimated him. Michael seized the opportunity. He used his other hand to grab the entity's head, his fingers digging into its scalp. He focused all his energy into a single, piercing thought. "Get out of my train." The entity screamed, a high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek that echoed through the tunnels. Its body began to convulse, its features contorting in a grotesque parody of pain. The air around it shimmered and crackled, and a dark, oily substance began to ooze from its pores. Slowly, agonizingly, the entity began to fade. Its form flickered and blurred, its features dissolving into a swirling vortex of darkness. Its grip on the emergency brake lever loosened, and its weight began to lift from Michael. With a final, desperate roar, the entity vanished, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. Michael slumped back in his seat, his body trembling, his mind reeling. He had done it. He had resisted the entity, he had adhered to the rules, and he had survived. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the night was far from over. The entity's disappearance offered Michael no respite. If anything, the atmosphere in the train car grew even more oppressive, the sense of dread intensifying with each passing moment. He knew the final station was approaching, and he could feel the darkness gathering, preparing for a final, desperate assault. The knocking, which had subsided briefly after the struggle with the entity, returned with a vengeance. It was no longer a rhythmic tapping, but a furious, deafening pounding that seemed to shake the very foundations of the train. The walls vibrated, the lights flickered violently, and the sound echoed through the tunnels like the drums of some unholy ritual. The shadows, which had been dancing in the periphery, began to coalesce, merging into a single, amorphous mass of darkness that writhed and twisted in the corners of the train car. They seemed to be alive, to have a will of their own, their tendrils reaching out towards him, their eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. And then, the passenger reappeared. He wasn't solid. Not anymore. He was a specter, a wraith, a fleeting image that flickered in and out of existence. But his presence was undeniable, his eyes burning with a hatred that transcended the physical realm. "You cannot escape me, driver," he hissed, his voice a distorted echo of his former self. "You are mine now. We are all mine." He lunged towards Michael again, his spectral hand reaching for the controls. He was weaker than before, his power diminished by Michael's resistance, but he was still dangerous, still capable of causing unimaginable harm. Michael fought to maintain control of the train, his hands trembling on the controls. The pounding was deafening, the shadows were closing in, and the passenger was relentlessly attacking him. His voice a constant barrage of taunts and threats. He knew he was approaching the final station, but he also knew that he was running out of time. The darkness was overwhelming, the pressure was unbearable, and he could feel his sanity slipping away. He had to stay strong, he had to hold on, but he didn't know how much longer he could resist. The final station was his only hope. But it was also his greatest fear. He knew that whatever awaited him there would be far worse than anything he had faced so far. Michael pushed the train to its absolute limit, the wheels screaming against the rails as he navigated the final stretch of tunnel. The spectral passenger continued to lunge and taunt. The knocking was a deafening cacophony, and the shadows writhed and pulsed around him, but he refused to yield. He focused on the tracks ahead, on the image of the final station, on the hope of escaping the nightmare that had consumed him. He could see the lights of the terminal in the distance, a beacon of salvation in the oppressive darkness. He gripped the controls tighter, his knuckles white, and pushed the train forward with every ounce of strength he possessed. The spectral passenger screamed in frustration, its form flickering and fading as the train approached the station. The knocking reached a fever pitch, a final, desperate attempt to break his resolve. The shadows surged forward, their tendrils reaching out to engulf him. But Michael held firm. He focused on the lights ahead, on the image of dawn, on the promise of escape. He ignored the taunts, the threats, the overwhelming darkness. He pushed the train forward, inching closer to the terminal with each passing second. And then, finally, the train emerged from the tunnel, screeching to a halt at the final station. As the doors opened, a wave of silence washed over him, a silence so profound that it was almost deafening. The knocking ceased, the shadows vanished, and the spectral passenger disappeared, leaving him alone in the eerily still train car. He looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. The train was empty, save for him. There were no passengers, no shadows, no signs of the horrors he had just endured. It was as if the entire night had been a figment of his imagination, a terrifying dream from which he had finally awakened. He stepped out of the train, his legs trembling beneath him. The platform was deserted, the air was still and cold, and the only sound was the gentle hum of the station's lights. He looked up at the sky, and a wave of relief washed over him. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. The darkness was receding, the shadows were fading, and the promise of a new day was finally within reach. He had survived the night owl. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would never be the same. The walk back to the main depot felt surreal, the city slowly awakening around him, oblivious to the horrors he had just endured. The sunlight felt alien on his skin, the sounds of traffic and construction a jarring contrast to the silence of the tunnels. He felt like he was walking between two worlds, the mundane reality of the city above and the dark, terrifying realm beneath. He returned the train to the designated bay, his movements mechanical and detached. He went through the post-run checklist, double-checking every gauge and switch, his mind still replaying the events of the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the darkness was still lurking just beyond the reach of the sunlight. As he was about to leave, he saw him, Old Man Hemlock, standing in the shadows near the entrance to the depot. He was watching Michael with a knowing look in his eyes, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Michael approached him, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to ask him questions, to demand answers, to understand what had just happened, but he couldn't find the words. Hemlock nodded, his eyes twinkling with a strange mixture of amusement and respect. "You made it," he said, his voice raspy but kind. Michael stared at him, his mind still reeling. "What was that?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "What happened down there?" Hemlock chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "That, son, was the night owl. It's not for everyone. Some can handle it, some can't. Some break the rules, some don't survive." Michael swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on Hemlock's face. "The rules, they're real, aren't they?" Hemlock shrugged, his eyes dancing with a mischievous light. "Real enough. Let's just say they're guidelines for surviving the night." He paused, his gaze becoming serious. "You passed the test, kid. You followed the rules, you kept your head, and you made it back in one piece. Not everyone can say that." He clapped Michael on the shoulder, his touch surprisingly strong. "Welcome to the club, son. You're one of us now." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the depot, leaving Michael alone with the weight of his experience and the chilling knowledge that he was now part of something he could never fully understand. Michael walked out of the depot, the sunlight feeling both comforting and accusatory. He was forever changed. He could no longer dismiss the superstitions of the older drivers as mere folklore. He had seen the darkness, he had felt its hunger, and he knew that the rules were real, that they were the only thing standing between the city and the horrors that lurked beneath. He was now part of the select few who understood the true rules of the night, the secret language of the tunnels, the unspoken pact with the darkness. He carried the weight of that knowledge with him, a burden and a privilege. He looked back at the depot, its brick facade bathed in the golden light of dawn. It seemed like an ordinary building, a place of routine and mundane tasks. But he knew better. He knew that it was a gateway to another world, a world of shadows and secrets, a world where the rules of reality no longer applied. He thought about his future, about his career with the MTA. He had wanted to prove himself, to earn the respect of his colleagues, to make a difference. He had achieved that, in a way he could never have imagined. But now he faced a different kind of challenge. Could he continue working on the subway, knowing what he knew? Could he face the darkness again, knowing the risks, knowing the price? Could he live with the memory of the woman on the platform, her silent scream echoing in his mind? He thought about Mallory, the driver who had broken the rules and disappeared without a trace. He thought about Hemlock, the old man who carried the secrets of the subway on his wrinkled face. He thought about the spectral passenger, the entity that had tried to break him, to claim his soul. He knew that he had a choice to make. He could walk away, leave the subway behind, and try to forget what had happened. He could try to return to his old life, to his old beliefs, to his old sense of normalcy. Or he could embrace his new reality, accept his fate, and continue to navigate the darkness, to protect the city from the horrors that lurked beneath. He could become a guardian of the tunnels, a keeper of the secrets, a warrior against the night. The decision weighed heavily on him, a burden almost as great as the one he had carried through the tunnels. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he could never be the same. He was forever marked by the night, all forever bound to the darkness beneath the city. He took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling his lungs. He looked out at the city, at the people rushing to work, at the buildings reaching towards the sky. He knew that they were counting on him, on the select few who understood the true rules of the night. And he knew what he had to do. He turned and walked towards the subway entrance, his steps firm and determined. The darkness awaited, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready.